Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on environmental science, and specifically going through our birding unit, looking at the size and the shape to identify birds. Let's get started on this next video. So when we go through and look for birds, and when we go through and do this in our class, what we're going to be looking for in Pennsylvania is a couple of things. We want to go through and look for an open field or some sort of wooded area that has a few things in it. We want to look for rows of deciduous and conifer-like trees. These are going to be important because the birds are going to be in those trees. We want to also look for small shrubbery and natural overgrowth within the fields. We're going to see different species of birds in this overgrowth. And depending upon what birds we're looking for, we might want to look for old infrastructure or infrastructure that these birds are going to go through and hide in. Now, in the surrounding areas, well, we might want to go through and look in estuaries and swamplands. We're going to be able to see some of these estuaries and swamplands in New Jersey and Delaware. And if we work our way on the East Coast, we're going to see different types of birds at these coastal regions. So when we're going through and looking for these birds, we're going to want to look for these characteristics in the places that we see. Now we're also going to want to go through and use some tools. We're going to use binoculars or field glasses. And binoculars are two telescopes mounted side by side and aligned in a point within the same direction. This allows the viewer to use both eyes when viewing distant objects. So when we go through and look at binoculars, our binoculars that we're going to use are going to consist of a couple of parts here. They're going to consist of an eyepiece that we're going to go put our eyes to. They're also going to consist of a central focus. They're also going to consist of ocular lenses, and these lenses are going to be key to work with our objective lenses to focus in on that object. And then all of this is going to be housed in the barrel of each of these eyepieces here. So what we can see is we're going to use our central focus and these variety of lenses to go through and zoom in on the birds that we're going to go through and look at. Now we're going to go through and identify birds using size and shape here. And what we're going to be doing is comparing and contrasting. Now what does this mean? Well, we want to use the size and the shape of birds that we already know to make predictions about the birds we do not know. So a common bird around our area is going to be the American robin. And I can use the size and the shape of this American robin to go through and identify other birds. I know this American robin is going to be about 11 inches tall. It's going to have a pretty round overall shape to it. So by using this bird as a baseline, I can say, well, this bird is smaller or not as round as this American robin that I already know what it looks like, or I can say the bird is much larger than this American robin. And I can use and compare and contrast and use scale to go through and identify my birds. Now what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to pick out, maybe it's your favorite bird or a bird you already know the name of. You're going to want to go through and research that bird and figure out how large it is and what its overall shape is. And what you're going to do is create a baseline for comparing and contrasting that bird that you know to the other birds that you don't know in the field. So if we look at this scale here, what we can see is we have a sparrow, a robin, and a crow. And I can use this scale to go through and identify other birds. So by going through and using this scale here, well, I can say it's smaller than a robin or bigger than a sparrow. And that's going to narrow down the quantity of birds that I'm going to go through and try to identify there. Now I can also go through and use a robin and a crow, for example. I can say it's bigger than a robin, but smaller than a crow. And again, what I'm trying to do is compare and contrast to identify the birds that I'm going through and looking at. Again, we want to take a bird and use it as a baseline for when we're going through and identifying these birds in the field. So let's go through and look at these two woodpeckers here. Now these two woodpeckers look very similar. I have a downy woodpecker and here I have a hairy woodpecker. Now how do I know that these two birds are different species and they look different? Well, I'm going to compare their size and shape, and I'm going to use that overall size and shape to go through and identify the difference between the two. So if I were to go through and put a grid and calculate the surface area, or just look at the overall surface area of the head and the bill, what I'm going to see on this downy woodpecker, it's going to take up about that much space. Hairy woodpecker here is going to take up about that much space. Now if I go through and I compare the two, what I can see are a couple differences here. The woodpecker on the right is going to take up about this much grid space as compared to the downy woodpecker on the left. So I know that these two are going to be most likely different species because I can use the shape and the size of their overall skull structure and bill structure to go through and identify the differences between the two. Now if we look at the bill and the skull structure of the woodpecker on the right, what I can see are a couple of things. The overall crown, or the top of the skull of that woodpecker, is going to be about that far of distance from the eye. I'm also going to be able to see that the bill is also pretty large compared to our other downy woodpecker. If we zoom in on the woodpecker on the left, we can see the overall crown structure is maybe similar sized because it's a slightly smaller bird, but we can see that that overall crown extends further and it has a much smaller bill as compared to the hairy woodpecker. So if I'm looking and comparing the two here, we can see the overall length of the bill and the overall length of the crown and the overall shape and size of the skull are very different. These are the type of things that I'm looking for when I'm going through and using size and shape to identify different birds. Now this is not always going to work. In this case, we have an American robin here versus a spotted towhee. And these two birds look very similar in shape and size. They're both about 11 to 12 inches tall. They both have very similar round shapes to them. They have very, very similar head and bill structures here. So we can't just use size and shape alone. We have to go through and use other types of techniques. We're going to have to look at the feather anatomy, colors, and behaviors in order to go through and identify them. So this is one skill that we're going to go through and build to go through and apply when going through and watching these birds. Alright, so did you guys learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things? Did you guys go through and learn about places to go through and spot birds? The best places that we're going to go through and look for in Pennsylvania and the surrounding areas. Did you guys also go through and learn about binoculars? Why we use them and the parts of the binoculars, so that way when we go through and use them in class, we know what we're looking at. And lastly, did we learn about bird identification, our first skill set, size and shape? Can we go through and compare size and shape to birds we already know to go through and correctly identify species? This is going to be the end of the video. I will see you all in class tomorrow.